The goal with this video is to introduce you to the Blueprint Visual Scripting System in Unreal Engine 4. The Blueprint Visual Scripting System was created by Epic Games for gameplay scripting. It is a node-based scripting or programming system. So instead of writing text-based scripts or programming, in a text editor, we basically wire nodes together to create our logic. The word blueprint also refers to game classes created using the Blueprint Visual Scripting System. Now, when we edit C++ code or some other text-based programming language, we'll typically do that in something like Visual Studio. So I'll right-click on here, this example, and you can see this will open up Visual Studio. Okay, in Visual Studio, you can see that we can now edit this text in here. We have nice features. So if I remove a semicolon, we can do debugging. So this does a good job of helping us out so we don't write buggy code. But the point is, this is a text-based programming language. And these files up here, so you see very interesting actor.h, very interesting actor.cpp, those typically map to a file that is actually on your hard drive. But again, if you want to open those up and you actually want to edit this file now, then you do it in Visual Studio, not in Unreal Engine. Now, Visual Studio is an example of an IDE, also known as an integrated development environment. So how do we then edit blueprints? Where do we do our visual scripting? Well, we actually do that in Unreal Engine. For this example, I have this table blueprint. So I can just open that up. Don't worry about how we create blueprints yet. We'll talk about that later. But as you can see, that opens up this editor, the blueprint editor. This is what it looks like. So we can edit our code in the event graph. You also have a viewport where we can see the objects basically that makes up this actor. In the event graph and in the construction script is where we will typically write code. And you can see we use these nodes and connect these nodes to write our gameplay logic. But this is a class or a single template. And as you can see, instead of opening a text-based editor such as Visual Studio, an IDE like Visual Studio, this opens up in Unreal Engine in the blueprint editor, and it's also called a blueprint. So whereas the C++ files and classes that I showed you previously are just considered a class, okay, it's a C++ class, these blueprint classes in Unreal Engine are simply referred to as blueprints. So you'll often hear it being referred to as blueprints. So these are also blueprints. So this is Blueprint Visual Scripting. But the actual classes themselves are also referred to as blueprints. But now we can create objects or instances of this class. So right now it's not doing anything, it's just a template or a blueprint. So what I can do is I can left click and drag one of those into my world. These are called actors, by the way, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. But now I have this instance of that class in my world. Now I can set its state. So I can change its location, its rotation. I can even change the mesh representation. Okay, so I can swap that out to something else. I can maybe assign another different kind of material. As you can see, that will change the material as well, and so forth. But that is simply an instance. That does not affect the template. If I drag out another template, you can see we get the default template back. Okay, that is this default template that we have right here. If I select this, you can see that we have this material assigned by default. I'll just zoom up on this. This is the default material and the default object basically that represents this actor or this class, in the world. So once it's instantiated, this is basically the object that will represent our actor. And this again is where you can set your defaults for this blueprint class. So I'll just delete this one actually. But the point is you can create multiple instances, also called objects, of this class, and you can change the state of each one of those, and have each one of those unique. So just because the template is set up in a specific way does not mean you cannot go and edit each individual instance of that particular class. So again, the state is basically the variables, whereas functions and events will change its behavior so that it does something. Now in the event graph, I just wrote this here. I'm basically just adding some offset and some local rotation as well to the table itself. So basically, if I go and click and play this now, you'll see that the actor moves up and rotates. So basically, this allows us to create functionality for our classes or for the objects, that we put in our world. And in that way, we can create interactivity. We can have fun and interesting things happen in our world. We can create doors and so on. Now, I mentioned that we have debugging tools in Visual Studio, right? And that is a very fancy IDE. And a lot of people use that primarily because of its functionality, that allows us to debug our code and to see what's going on with our code, to solve various problems and so on. I'll just cancel that. Of course, it makes sense that we need some debugging tools in this here as well. So this is basically, again, our scripting environment. This is where we will write our code. Now, I'll just go and right-click on that, toggle breakpoint, go back to this first tab where I have my map open. This is the level editor again. And as soon as I click play, this will jump back to over here, because that will basically get called immediately after we hit play. Then it will go over here. We can inspect what's going on, change some of the values if we want, and so on. So I'll click play here, and you can see it jumps to this. You can see we have these fun, visual cues that shows us what is going on. I'll just stop that. So again, we have the ability to create classes. We have the ability to add variables and functions to our classes to create the state and the behavior of those classes. We can write out our logic, we can debug it, and so on. So it's just a different way of programming. It is still programming, so it's kind of deceiving if you have these advertisements that say you can build a game without writing a single line of code. While that is technically true, because you won't be editing your code in Visual Studio, for example, you will be using either visual scripting, such as this system in Unreal Engine, or some other form of writing your logic. So this is still programming. And even as a C++ programmer coming to this system, you don't just jump in and start programming. It is a bit easier if you already have a programming background, but it is still something that you have to get used to. Instead of code blocks and simply writing your code from top down, you have these wires that you have to connect. And that can kind of be time consuming compared to a text-based editor. And that is what a lot of people complain about when they compare Unreal Engine to something like Unity, for example, which has a higher level programming language that it uses for writing its game logic with, called C#. And a lot of people enjoy using that. It's really quick to write your code. But as you've just seen, this is a nice visual way of writing your code. And while this is slower than C++, it can be compiled to C++. So you don't have to worry about it too much. Okay, if you want to write your game in Blueprints, you can do that. But the real fun is when you start to combine C++ and Blueprints.